So today we're going to talk about album art and design as visual communication. And in this presentation, I'm going to give you many different examples of album art and album art specifically focused around a concept as opposed to it necessarily just showing the artist or just being a picture of the artist on the cover. So hopefully this gives you some ideas and some inspiration as you begin thinking about how you might approach your 3 vinyl cover designs for your partner for our major project. So here's a few examples of some album art that has an interactive component to it. This CD called Casadaga by Bright Eyes was released in 2007. And what's interesting is that the album art is totally static, like it doesn't look like a whole lot is going on, until you open it up and look at it through using a spectral decoder. So when you slide this tool around the outside of the CD cover or the inside of the CD cover, you can see different images that relate back to the spiritual and religious themes in the music. And so there's some interesting hidden phrases in English and in Greek. And I've included an example here that you can actually kind of watch and see how this works. And someone was really excited about it. But as she's moving that spectral decoder, you can see the palm trees. It's really, I'm not even exactly sure how this optical illusion works, but it is fascinating. The dopest CD cover I've ever seen is what she writes. So all over the interior, you can just slide this thing around and see some really interesting pictures that pop up that are hidden otherwise. And so there's this interactive process that comes about in sort of the exploration of the music, the exploration of the CD. It's great. Another interesting interactive cover is this Black Moses album cover released by Isaac Hayes. And interestingly, when you fold out the vinyl record, it actually becomes, the shape of a cross. It's it's his full body being displayed here. And the album art is by a photographer by the name of Joel Brodsky. And he's super well known for photographing a lot of different musicians, including Jim Morrison. And there's a little bit more information about him here. But what's great about this is that already sort of having the implication with the album title Black Moses being up front and center, and then this sort of like implied call to action where the musician, the artist Isaac Hayes, is sort of in this Christ-like pose within this within the actual folded out vinyl record is a really fascinating way to have the viewer or the listener interact with this photograph. Some of you guys might remember the release of Teenage Dream by Katy Perry in 2010. I don't know who the photographer was here, but what was really memorable about this album cover was if you bought it and you opened it out of its plastic wrap, you got the scent of cotton candy. So the actual CD and the inside of it was scented like cotton candy. And interestingly, after the first release of it, a lot of people were like, oh my God, this smells terrible. So it actually was torn off the shelves and then they re-released it with a different flavor of cotton candy instead. So you have this sort of scratch and sniff effect happening. So those are a few examples of interactive designs. As far as social critique, of course, a lot of artists, a lot of musicians make work that directly critiques certain social norms or things that we would expect. And one of the most iconic vinyl record covers is the Live Evil album cover, which is a record by Miles Davis, released in 1971, jazz artist. And the album art was created by Maddie Clarvine. And interestingly, the album cover was painted before Davis asked if he'd be up for collaborating. And the back cover was painted after Miles Davis suggested this to him. So, quote, "I was doing the picture of a pregnant woman for the cover, and the day I finished, Miles called me up and said, 'I want a picture of life on one side and evil on the other,' and all he mentioned was a toad. Then next to me was a copy of Time magazine, which had J. Edgar Hoover on the cover, and he looked just like a toad. So I told Miles I found the toad, and this was the sort of evil side of the vinyl record cover. So there's an interesting dichotomy happening here, and it's perfect for the title of the album, Live Evil. The Plastic Surgery Disasters album by the Dead Kennedys was released in 1982. And on this album cover, you see a very iconic picture by photographer Michael Wells called Hand. And this is actually a photojournalistic image that's been used on actually 3 different bands' album covers. But I think the Dead Kennedys did it in one of the most iconic ways. So it's interesting because the original photo is a super emotive picture of a child in Uganda holding hands with a missionary. And if you know about the Dead Kennedys music, it's sort of a punk rock, post-punk band talking about anarchy and why governments don't work, sort of screw the man mentality. So there's something that sort of transcends the music in some ways, looking at this photo along with the musical content. Go To by XTC in 1978. The album art here is by Hypnosis, who we're going to talk about a little bit more. This is a really prominent album cover designer, super interesting work. And this is one of the most ironic album covers, in my opinion, because it's literally about why sort of the commodity of music or the commodity of record labels. And this is a critique happening in 1978. And really for a lot of the time that the music industry has been around up until now, when many artists can release music on their own without adhering to a label and without the pressure for people to purchase their music, other than, if you're trying to do that exclusively to make money. But they actually printed this album cover saying things like, "This is a record cover. This writing is the design upon the record cover. The design is to help sell the record. We hope to draw your attention to it and encourage you to pick it up. When you have done that, maybe you'll be persuaded to listen to the music. In this case, XTC's Go To album. Then we want you to buy it. The idea being that the more that you buy this record, the more money Virgin Records, the manager Ian Reed, and XTC themselves will make. To the aforementioned, this is known as pleasure. A good cover design is one that attracts more buyers and gives more pleasure. This writing is trying to pull you in, much like an eye-catching picture." So anyway, I'm not going to read the whole thing, but I would encourage you to, because it's kind of hilarious. And I've included a little bit of information down here about Hypnosis, this English art design group based in London, specialized in creating cover art. And we'll look at some of this, but for Pink Floyd, Black Sabbath, UFO, Led Zeppelin, AC/DC, Paul McCartney and the Wings, Def Leppard. I mean, there's some really, really big names here. So Hypnosis was a super smart design collective. Mezzanine by Massive Attack was a 1998 album that came out that sort of had a trip hop, sort of grunge meets synth thing going on. And what was interesting, if you think about what all is getting released in 1998, it's bands like Backstreet Boys and NSYNC and Bewitched and Britney Spears, a lot of really pop stuff, which was really popular. And, the album cover sort of showed that. And what the band Massive Attack wanted to do was create something that was going to be the opposite of that, like something really gross, something disgusting, something that people are going to sort of do a double take at when they're looking at it. And so they worked with Nick Knight, who's a really prominent photographer, and designer Tom Hinkston to put together a kind of haunting, super close-up scorpion picture. And I've included in here an interview between Tom Hingston and with Nick Knight, and sort of the whole process of putting this together, talking about the Spice Girls, all the boy bands, and all of that. And so it's interesting how this sort of directly assaults the album cover, sort of what you would expect to see being sold at that time. In Through the Outdoor by Led Zeppelin in 1979. The album art is by Storm Thorgerson, who was one of the design members of the group Hypnosis. And if you look closely at this, you're going to see these are each their own print version of the record cover. And what's great about this is they're all taken the same scene, the picture of the same scene, a guy in a bar, sort of a tiki-looking bar type atmosphere with all of the greenery sort of hanging around. Not quite tiki bar, but definitely an interesting space. Maybe a bar fight occurred. There's a sort of narrative implied by the fact that there's things scattered around the floor, a chair off to its side. This guy, like, very interestingly in his white hat, not really paying attention to anything, and the bartender, there's a woman in the background. And so there's 6 different vantage points represented in this print. And the great thing is, if you were to go to the store to try to buy the album, or even collect all 6 Led Zeppelin versions of this album, all of the packaging was just in this sort of blank newsprint sort of container where you didn't really know what you were going to get. So you purchase Led Zeppelin in Through the Outdoor, and if you actually want to get all 6, you probably have to trade with some of your friends who are also hardcore fans of Led Zeppelin. That What Is Not by Public Image Limited in 1992 is a post-punk band who wanted to create a statement with one of their albums, and created this super sexy, super sexualized image that is also simultaneously really ambiguous. But it is eye-catching, it is somewhat disgusting, it is, again, not the thing you would necessarily expect to see on a 90s pop album. So there's definitely some boundary pushing things happening here. And I think they did a lot of really interesting things with their album work. In fact, going so ironically to create this album cover that critiqued high design culture itself by creating, a very, very basic blank album cover in 1986 that literally just said album in a Helvetica font, very clean. And then that was it. Strange Mercy by St. Vincent in 2011. Album art was designed and conceptualized by St. Vincent and photographed by Tina Tyrell. What's great about this album and the way that it was created sonically is that Annie Clark, who is the woman who is St. Vincent, she's an incredible guitar player, synth player, singer. She decided to do an experiment of isolation. So it's interesting because right now, obviously, we're all quarantined and in isolation ourselves. But, there's many artists who seek an escape or seek a getaway and don't want to be around other people and want to focus on the work and focus on the creation. And that's it, be away from all of the other stimulus of the everyday world. And so St. Vincent had this idea for the album cover after she'd recorded it, and so she essentially made that concept happen by working with Tina Tyrell, a female photographer, make this amazing sort of, gasping for air type image through the, a plastic bag thing. So now for something completely different. Hip-hop used to have a really bad rap as far as album covers are concerned. And at the time, hip-hop in, you know, the 1990s was a really DIY culture, and I think there's a lot of that that still sort of remains, like you know, people making beats, people making hip hop, people, you know, putting a whole bunch of different influences together into their own creative sonic work. From the article that I was looking at, talking specifically about Pen and Pixel, who were a collaborative who designed a lot of these sort of southern hip hop records like T-Mac Shinin' and Big Demon, which is a 1999 album. It writes, with the internet as hip hop's most influential medium and the rise of blogging and social media spearheading a growing interest in photography and graphic design. I mean, Photoshop came out in 1998, so people are like, oh, dang, we can actually do some stuff. And so you see these really intense collages that have all of these material aspects. This guy is walking a leopard with like an orange Jeep in the background. There's a lot of hilarious things happening. I mean, the tools are brand new. Let's use them. Let's DIY our own album covers. Kind of awesome. But if you look at some of the styles that Pen and Pixel used, a lot of it is digital collage. A lot of it is digital collage, specifically working in Photoshop between 1997 and 1999. It is hilarious. So we have Two Def Straight Doing the Fool, 1997. We have Indo G, Angel Dust, 1998. Again, just these hilarious, ridiculous, layered collages. So for your album design, depending on who you're designing for and kind of the theme of their music, you might determine that you want to go more of a maximalist approach and have a ton of layers, or something that's really like thoughtfully minimal and slick and contemporary. There's so many different options. So Von Oliver is another very well-known album cover designer, and he created the album cover for Pod, which is by the Breeders, released in 1991. And what Von Oliver is really known for is pushing the boundaries of how he uses typography when he's orchestrating his designs. Happiness is a Warm Gun is one of the track names on this record, and that was his inspiration in terms of putting together something that was super abstract and kind of creepy and had a sense of motion. So he's combining his own paintings and watercolors with really interesting, many times original typography to put these album covers together. Another one that he designed, Split by Lush, 1994. You have these sort of lemons hanging out, but then this this logo and then text that appears over here with the short narrative story. Here's another interesting one by Von Oliver and slightly more recent. Head Carrier by the Pixies came out in 2016, and here you see the text of the name of the band's name, the Pixies, comes up in both versions of this album cover, but it's sort of just enough information that you can tell that it says the Pixies, but at the same time it's just really nicely integrated into the full visual space, and you have this sort of creepy alien head that's peeking out from the corners of this like larger, strange, sort of sci-fi looking void. And I encourage you, if you haven't heard of some of these artists, listen to a couple of their songs and sort of think about how the album cover correlates with the music that you hear as an interesting experiment. Appropriation is another pretty big topic as far as art in general. You might be sort of freaking out writing project proposals. Oh my God, I'm sure someone's done this before. I'm sure I'm not the first person to do this. Honestly, same is true with a lot of art that gets made constantly. A lot of it is, based off of a reference, or, it might be influenced by something. it's really, really hard to find or to make things that are 100% original, because there's always an underlying context in the entire history of art and art making that, we're all creating within this world. So when we talk about appropriation, many times we're talking about taking existing works of art, like what you guys are doing in the imaginary landscape, for example, and potentially reconfiguring them, remodifying them into something completely different. So the Smashing Pumpkins put out an album in 1995. This is a Chicago-based band, an amazing female bass player, and one of those bands that has an extremely unique sound, in part because their singer's voice is so high and a little bit whiny and not entirely what you expect, or at least in 1995 what one would expect. But this album cover for Melancholy, this mystery girl, it looks like a painting that you've seen before, kind of, but it's like a little bit too sexy based on where her hand is, and her eyes are like almost rolling back into the back of her head. If you want to hear the whole story behind this album cover, I've included a link to an NPR Music article that came out called "The Story Behind an Iconic Album Cover." But John Craig is actually an illustrator from Pittsburgh who was living in Wisconsin and is the person who created this design. So Melancholy's figurehead is a girl who never really existed, a daydreaming star nymph with a split personality. And by that, we mean she's actually created out of two different existing paintings created between the 1500s and almost the 1800s. So John Craig took Jean-Baptiste Grouez's The Souvenir, or Fidelity, this woman sort of tightly holding her puppy as she looks up into who knows where, and then Raphael's St. Catherine of Alexandria. And he sort of brings them both together into this new and strange looking figure on the album cover. Kind of fascinating. Another example of appropriation is the record Paul's Boutique, which is a 1989 album by the Beastie Boys. And what's interesting about this particular cover is that what you're looking at here, what was actually printed on the vinyl records, and what you can see is only a small subsection of a huge panoramic photograph that was originally photographed by Jeremy Chaton. And so if you look at the very original photograph, this whole panoramic shot with compositing a large format image, the part that was actually used for the Beastie Boys album cover is just this square on the far left. Another interesting example of appropriation is the Power, Corruption, and Lies album from 1983 by Peter Saville. So we already, looking at this, it looks like it was originally a painting, but Peter Saville took this original painting, modified the colors, added sort of a visual joke or a visual pun by putting in this little swatch color palette of a number of different colors to kind of break that up and make a visual joke. You'll also notice there's no text on the cover that says the actual title of the album, but the picture, which was color modified pretty significantly, was taken from A Basket of Roses by the French artist Henri Fantin-Latour. And so it's quite different, and yet here it feels super contemporary and super modern. And again, this is the 1983 interpretation of this older still life image. I don't exactly know what the date is, but it's absolutely appropriation. In fact, it had so much popularity that even Supreme, the brand that has been somewhat popular and perhaps losing traction, especially as of late, Supreme and Vans collaborated to create these shoes based off of New Order's album cover, which was based off of that original painting. So it's sort of this image that's all of a sudden become appropriated multiple times and now stands for a super synthetic, artificial, synth-sounding band being New Order. So, yeah. Feelings by David Byrne came out in 1997. And thinking about appropriation, thinking about sort of conceptual, what is this about? The whole album is about a fakeness or artificiality, and what David Byrne wanted to have on the cover was an actual, made mannequin of he himself to sort of show, to what extent is he human, plastic, or aren't we all? So Stefan Sagmeister, if you do feel like looking up more of his work, he's designed album covers for Lou Reed, OK Go, The Rolling Stones, David Byrne, Jay-Z, Aerosmith, Pat Metheny, and they're just really smart covers that go well with the concept of the album release. Of course, we can't talk about music without talking about altered states and otherworldly designs. The altered state that you're in psychologically or psychedelically when you're consuming music. So much art has come out of this, and so many album covers have come out of this as well. This sort of sci-fi theme, the going to an other world. Third Stage by Boston is a super popular album cover for Boston fans because of these iconic illustrations of strange sci-fi spaceships and rocket ships close to Earth. But what's really interesting about the illustrations of them is that many of the actual mechanical devices that you're looking at all are a musical reference. So if you look at the spaceship, and all of them actually, they're all guitars that are emitting flames from that middle resonant hole in the center. This spaceship is all constructed out of a pipe organ, and it's creating this spaceship that's, flying over the vast landscape of Earth. And so there's been t-shirts designed. Boston fans are just crazy about the album artwork that modifies instruments and turns them into flying space devices. And if you want to learn more about the process here, I've included a link to an interview with Paula Scheer, who designed this particular concept, and then it was later illustrated by Roger Huyson. Dark Side of the Moog by Klaus Schultz and Pete Nomlock was an album series that came out, all as vinyl records, between 1994 and 2008. And each of the vinyl records actually link together to form a larger picture. So if you want to see the full spread or the full catalog here of their vinyl releases, you'll notice that the moon connects across these different album covers. Over here you can see there's connection points. And so there's a sort of, benefit to having the entire series in a way. And these are all covers of Pink Floyd songs. The band Yes, very popular alternative rock band or rock band of the 1970s, and John Anderson is still alive and working today and creating really sonically immersive 5.1 surround sound album releases, but has always been interested in a sort of altered state or heightened state when listening to music and thinking about it that way. And so he's collaborated multiple times with the illustrator Roger Dean to create these almost I feel like they almost look like concept art for video games. Like you're entering a virtual reality and exploring something completely new and interesting. So Also great inspiration for a sort of imaginary landscape or a sci-fi world or experience. The Ladder by Yes in 1999, another collaboration with Roger Dean. And Like It Is in 2014. You have these just beautiful painted colors and really strange, like it sort of looks like an explosion, but also like a gun, but also like it could be another secondary horizon or landscape or platform. And then Roger Dean has also designed these more sort of stick-on looking illustrations for the band Asia, like this album cover for Alpha, released in 1983. And we can't talk about Altered States without talking about this iconic album cover, Revolver by the Beatles, designed by Klaus Voormann. And essentially what the Beatles wanted for this particular album cover, in addition to it being a collage of both photographic images of them as well as these drawings, and the drawings, what each Beatle is depicted as being in another state of consciousness, or the older images appear to be tumbling out of them. So, you know, these guys are feeling good. They are doing potentially now legal activities in Illinois. But the facial expressions, for that matter, are sort of blank or thoughtful or, you know, looking off the frame. This is the only Beatle who's looking directly at us. Fox Confessor Brings the Flood by Nico Case was an album cover for this particular record that came out in 2008. And interestingly, Julie Morstadt drew all of the cover designs. Are a little bit dark. You can see she's holding another woman's head and talking to a group of foxes. And what's great about the illustrations is that they've played a part in many of her music videos. So if you're interested in this style, I'm not going to play it here, but on your own time, I would absolutely recommend you guys open up the slides from this lecture and take a look at the illustrated video here. It is just absolutely beautiful. A more literal example, Ladies and Gentlemen, We Are Floating in Space, an album released by Spiritualized in 1997 and with album art designed by Mark Farrow. What's great about this particular vinyl cover is it's designed to look like the sort of RX prescription drug or pill box that you might get. So one tablet, 70 minutes, that's what you're getting from the album. And then on the back, you can sort of see almost like, you know, a women's health magazine spread where there's all of these sort of drug things to be aware of. It's all written in the font Helvetica, and it literally has the packaging of prescription medicine, which in the 90s, you're getting prescription medicine companies, pharmaceutical companies just absolutely blowing up without a whole lot of government restrictions. And so there's also, of course, a bit of a cultural critique going on in here. But what's great about the details here, kind of zooming in here, what are the active ingredients of Spiritualized? The tablet contains the following active ingredients in a white tablet marked DEDCD 034. You have Spaceman vocals, Fender Telecaster. You have Kate Radley on vocals, Continental. You have Sean Cook on the Fender jazz bass. You know, it has a sort of musical breakdown, but within the format of a prescription drug. One of my personal favorites, not so guilty pleasure, is the album cover for Kesha's 2017 album Rainbow, with album art by Robert Beatty. Definitely look up more of his work online if you're interested in this style. It is super surreal. It is a little bit creepy and interesting. Just absolutely stunning, fabulous, hilarious work. But this album came out right as Kesha was sort of being released from the mental health care institutions where she was living in Chicago for a while and finally was able to get out of, or the contract with her previous producer ended, and so she essentially had the freedom to do and make whatever she wants. So this album became really an expression of that ability. So you have like donut spaceships and a dripping eyeball, and then it's collaged in with this photograph of Kesha seen from behind with her hair trailing back behind her, and then a really extreme one-point perspective into the sort of light at the end of the tunnel, so to speak. And then Alex Grey. Alex Grey has done almost all of the artwork for the rock band Tool, and this is one of the more well-known albums, Lateralis. Super detailed painted work, just super intricate, and a lot of Alex Grey's painted works deal with the body and the structures of the body and the details and the intricacy of the muscle structures, the eyes, the capillaries that all come together. And interestingly, Tool has loved working with Alex Grey so much that they've actually had him create many of the super theatrical, huge visuals that play on stage whenever Tool is performing. And so it's almost like the audience gets to be visually immersed into these artistic painted landscapes that exist and have really become the visual identity of Tool, based on their album covers, their live shows, etc. And then musicians that draw, kind of a last category, but also, with DIY culture and a lot of creative people doing a lot of interesting creative things, why not? So The Harrow and the Harvest is an album by Gillian Welch. Came out in 1998, and she did all of the illustration and etching for her own album cover, and it went through this massive printing press process to create all of the vinyl records to each be unique and interesting and detailed. And so when you buy the album on vinyl, you're not only getting the vinyl record, but you're getting a work of art that is an editioned printed vinyl piece. So if you want to learn a little bit about the printmaking process and how this album cover was physically printed, I've included a YouTube video that I would encourage you to spend some time with and watch. It's really interesting. Art Angels by Grimes, 2015. Claire Boucher has now become extremely well known as both a musician and a public figure in many different ways, but is also an artist, draws, writes her own music, creates her own beats, layers, hundreds of drum samples on top of each other for her tracks. So super, super interesting, but she has these sort of sinister album covers and designs, and many of which she's drawn herself. And in her release, Art Angels, she actually created and drew a different picture for each of the tracks that are on that album that are sort of standalone, could be included in a zine or something. And they're quite haunting and interesting and dreamlike and scary, but also beautiful and slick and modern in so many ways. So the art itself is sort of pushing boundaries as well as the music. So we might be asking ourselves, what's the point of albums in a post-album era? Most people find their music online. Most people are streaming things on Spotify, looking at YouTube, finding things on social media, spending time on TikTok. There's a very different culture around albums and listening to a full album now than there even was 10 or 20 years ago. And yet there is still a subculture of people who will go out and buy a vinyl record or go to a record store and have that sort of feeling of authenticity. So what I'm asking you to do is sort of think about what it would be like if you were creating an object. What would it feel like to hold the thing in your hand, printed what you've designed with the music on it? What does that mean? So if you are interested in this topic on an intellectual level and you want to hear a really fascinating discussion around it, this isn't required or anything, but I have included a New York Times Popcast. It's sort of a podcast episode that really asks this question and takes a deep dive into the discussion of, the difference between the large vinyl record and what you see as a tiny square on a screen whenever you're streaming music. So an interesting release by the New York Times. If you are interested in a deeper dive into any of these noted artists or designers, I've included the full list here in the slides as well, and then some citations if you want to read further into sort of the ideas that I've mentioned in the lecture today.